Hello and welcome. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to watch this recording about understanding climate change in your territory from the Otipemisiwak Métis government of the Métis Nation within Alberta. My name is Ali Greenslade. I'm an engagement coordinator and policy analyst on the environment and climate change team, and I will be walking through the information in the session with you today. Before we get any further, to get us started, I'm going to share an opening prayer from knowledge holder Norma Spicer to help set the stage for today.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, through prayer we lift our thought and expectations to you. You made a world of wonder, a world so beautiful that takes our breath away, and yet we recognize that your world is grieving. As the diversity of your world becomes less diverse, we all share a planet and a need for water and sustenance. We live in a world of endings and extinctions. We have misused our power through consumerism and unrestrained capitalism. Lord, we are in awe of the formidable power of nature, but in these times of expected drought, flooding, and disasters, may we also come to comprehend its complex fragility. Let the teachings today tell us of the climate risk and vulnerability we face in Alberta. Deepen our gratitude for all you have made and awaken us a renewed commitment to care for the earth and each other. Inspire us to wisely use the riches of creation with wisdom and to ensure that their blessings are shared by all. Inspire our Métis leaders with openness to listen to those most affected by climate change and with courage to act urgently and wisely so that our communities may be healed and restored, and all our Métis people and generations to come may delight in it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thank you so much to knowledge holder Norma for sharing those opening words with us. So what are we doing today exactly? Essentially, we've heard from Métis citizens that they're witnessing changes to the land and the climate, from lakes getting warmer, smoke getting worse, berries shriveling up. We wanted to provide an opportunity to learn a little bit more about some of these impacts. As we've also heard, it can be confusing with so many sources of information. It's sometimes hard to know what to believe. So in terms of climate change, so a portion of today's session will be talking about what climate change is, the science kind of behind it, and how it is impacting us in Alberta now and in the future. We'll also be pausing for a few poll questions throughout to gauge your thoughts, concerns, and experiences with climate change. And finally, why are we doing this? We're going to build a report with citizen feedback to help us better understand and act on things like wildfires, floods, extreme heat, so that the Otipemisiwak Métis Nation can be better prepared for the risks and impacts of tomorrow. So for the session today, we will be doing an overview of the goals of this presentation. We're going to introduce ourselves in a moment, then get into the climate data, so climate risks, climate change, and then we, in the live sessions, will have a chance for some breakout rooms and questions. Moving along. So while you're listening today, I hope you will think about the changes you're learning about and think about what would help you and your family and the Métis community be in better shape to be able to respond to these changes. Like what would make you sleep better at night and feel more prepared? I also recognize this topic can be hard. I've studied it and worked in it for years. And it can be challenging to think about and evoke certain emotions. This process is entirely voluntary and you can leave at any point. We value everyone's voices and will have different opportunities to participate. And if you're watching this before the end of December, we will have a survey to participate in as well. So who are we? We are the Otipemisiwak Métis government of the Métis Nation within Alberta. We're here to provide services to citizens that are Métis specific and rooted in addressing the needs of the Métis within Alberta. I myself, as I mentioned, I'm Allie Greenslade. I'm a climate engagement coordinator and policy analyst with the nation. I've worked on the environment and climate change team for a little over 2 years. I myself am not Métis. I've grown up in Alberta, spending a lot of time out at Pigeon Lake, neighboring Musketees, and I currently live in Amiskouchi, Waskayagan, Edmonton, and Fort Edmonton Métis district. I have a background in environmental science and a master's degree in climate action leadership, and I've been fortunate enough to listen to many Otipemisiwak Métis Nation of Alberta citizens talking about environmental concerns. And I'm hoping this information shared today will be a helpful piece of the puzzle as we continue working to be good stewards of the land and fighting for a better tomorrow. But this is a big undertaking and we cannot do it alone. So we have partnered with some friends at the Resilience Institute who have a lot of experience in this work and will be the experts sharing some of the information today. And, lastly, why are we doing this? We're doing this for the next generation. This is one of the many quotes from information that we already have talking about the youth in the future. I was at a Métis Youth Summit last week, and the youth are very concerned about their future and being able to live in a healthy environment. And so it's part of our responsibility to act on this. I often say that this is part of a bigger project called the Climate Risk and Vulnerability Assessment. Today is a piece of it to share information about climate change. But it's also ultimately, creating a roadmap about how can be better prepared. And I like to think about it in terms of, if you were expecting a baby, you might get that book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, to help you, to help prepare yourself for the challenges and, all the things you can expect with raising a child. This project is kind of like that, the climate change version of What to Expect When You're Expecting. So we can be better prepared for tomorrow and for the next generation. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to the Resilience Institute to introduce themselves and get on with their presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and to listening to this presentation. My name is Henry Penn. I'm a senior research fellow at the Resilience Institute. I'm originally from the UK. I've lived in the US before coming to Canada, and I've been here for the past 8 or so years, mostly in the Yukon, but 2 years living in Calgary. My professional background is in civil engineering, but particularly supporting communities to find adaptation solutions to climate change, to the impact of climate change, and building community resilience for them. And I will pass it over to my colleague, Jeff.
Thank you, Harry. Tancha Kilo. Good day, everybody. My name is Jeff Baker. I'm the Education and Knowledge Mobilization Lead with the Resilience Institute. I am a Métis person, and I'm coming to you today from the small village of Marcelin in Saskatchewan in Treaty 6 territory. Before joining the Resilience Institute, I was an assistant professor and chair in Indigenous education at the University of Saskatchewan, where my teaching and research all focused on finding ways to ethically and respectfully weave Indigenous and Western scientific knowledge systems. After that, I spent some time with the Cree community of Mistawasis Nehewak as a senior policy analyst and Indigenous food sovereignty specialist, and just very happy to have a chance to share with you today. So thank you very much for joining us. Before we move on, we'll share a little bit about our organization, just to inform you a little bit. So we're an Alberta-based national charitable organization with team members from across Canada, from coast to coast. Our mission is to minimize the suffering caused by climate impacts. And our work is focused primarily on strengthening resilience in small, rural, and Indigenous communities, to the current near future consequences of climate change. And those communities are often less well supported, have less capacity to adapt to the coming changes and the current changes. So that's who we focus with. And we do our work by taking a very interconnected approach to our programming. So we work with applied research, participatory informed education. We work to synthesize and weave together knowledge systems, and certainly recognizing that the status quo is no longer working. We really also try to inspire transformative change in the work that we do. And before turning things over to Harry again, who's going to be sharing sort of the Western scientific view of climate change and what's been happening, I just wanted to comment a little bit more on this idea of weaving knowledge systems and this idea of walking in two worlds, which is something Métis people are intimately familiar with. We have a quote here from the Métis Nation Climate Change Strategy. It just says, "We are the bridge. We see the best in both worlds, and we're open to new ideas for how to move forward to set things right." And that quote is really applicable for our organization as well. As we work with different communities across the country, we do our best to honor and engage with that local knowledge from the citizens, the people of that place, who know the land and who know what's happening. We value that just as strongly as we value the climate data we receive from our climate scientists. In fact, some of the projections that Harry is going to be sharing lately, they're informed, largely by weather stations and forecasting kind of equipment and programming, but they also take into account local observations of people from across the world. So even at that level, that knowledge is represented. So I wanted to emphasize that. And we also included this image on the right, which was taken from the Indigenous Resilience Report from the Government of Canada. And it's really to be understood in this context of Wahkotuan, which is a Northern Michif or Cree term referring to kinship. This idea that we are connected and have kinship relations with everything in creation. And as I mentioned, Harry is going to be explaining the kind of Western scientific view of climate change, which is really important for the work that we do. But I think it's important to acknowledge that Indigenous people also have our own understandings of climate change that can be understood through this idea of pastahuan. Pastahuan is a Cree Northern Michif word that refers to the breaking of natural laws, of not following the guidance that was given to us on how to behave respectfully as humans in this world. When you look at the diagram, that circle on the left side, that's sort of the origin of why we're in the situation that we're in. That we exhibiting a lack of care and respect for Mother Earth as the root cause of the changes that we're seeing. And so what are the solutions as we move around the circle of all relations? The next circle there is to reconnect with the land and with the culture, and to spend time, get to know the land again, to re-engage with our cultural practices. By doing so, we can move to the next circle where we'll have more opportunities to observe and experience the land and the things that are changing. And through observing those changes, knowing what's happening, we'll have a better idea of what to do in response, hopefully heal the land. And as we know through that kinship relationship, we can only be as healthy as the land that we occupy and that we make use of, that supports everything that we do. And of course, that final circle there, we're doing all of this for our future generations, for our children and grandchildren. I have a daughter, a 16-year-old daughter myself, who has a lot of concerns about what's coming up for her and her generation and those to come. So it's important that we all do what we can to leave the best world we can. And with that, I will turn things back to Harry, who's going to go through some Western science understandings of climate change. So thank you, Harry.
Thanks, Jeff. So yes, as we've already sort of discussed in this presentation so far, climate change is a huge topic. And it's far too big, I think, to go through in one presentation or in one session. So what we're going to do is take a little time to share with you what we're focusing on and why, and to go through a few climate change terms and concepts. So the first is on weather and climate. And so two terms that I think are often used perhaps interchangeably or maybe in the same context, but they have quite different meanings when we get into a more detailed discussion of climate change. So weather describes conditions, things like the temperature, whether it's raining, wind, cloudiness, that kind of thing. And they describe them in a place or a region on a short-term basis. So that's hour to hour, day to day, and sometimes weeks or months. This is what you're going to your phone or your favorite website for to get that weather forecast on the description of the conditions that matter most to you. And so we know that weather can change dramatically in a place or in a region from a day-to-day basis. Especially this time of the year, at the middle of November, end of October, we're constantly going from a hot, dry day to a wet, cold day. These are the descriptions and realities that we use to describe our weather. On the other hand, climate refers to the average weather conditions over 30 or more years. And so, for example, if we were to describe southern Alberta as being typically windy, we are describing an aspect of that region's climate. And so climate changes more slowly because it represents an average of weather over a longer period of time. But maybe to give this a little bit more context, we can use an analogy. So the weather describes in our image here, it tells us what we wear each day. So if it's a hot day, we might wear a t-shirt or a lighter article of clothing. If it's going to be raining or we expect it to be raining, we're going to bring a jacket and some different shoes and that kind of thing. So those constant decisions, those constant changes, that's reflective of our experience of the weather. Climate, on the other hand, describes what we would see if we went into our closet. So as I mentioned, I used to live up in the Yukon, and the climate up there is quite different to lots of parts of Alberta. And so you would have seen, thicker sweaters, larger jackets, that kind of things. I have some friends who live in the southern US, and so if I went down to visit them, I'd look in their closet and I would see, again, clothing that represented the climate that they lived in, more t-shirts, shorts, lighter articles of clothing. And so that's sort of the distinction between the climate and the weather in terms of how we're going to use these terms as we go through this work and this presentation.
Thanks, Harry. We're just going to take a quick pause before we get into the rest of the content to kind of gauge. I want you to think, how familiar are you with climate change science? Harry just mentioned climate change is a huge topic, and often, sometimes we think about it in terms of weather or climate, and weather is something we're very familiar with as humans. We talk about it, all the time to each other. It's a very common topic to come up in small talk. But all of a sudden, when we start thinking about climate, there seems to be a lot more questions and sometimes uncertainty. So I urge you just to take a moment to think about how familiar are you with climate change science, and maybe how confident are you in your understanding of it. And then we'll move along to get into some of those specifics.
Thank you. So the next set of terminology that we want to think about has to do with greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly how they relate to increasing temperatures that we're seeing across, all across Alberta, but across the world more generally. And so we're going to try and use another analogy here. We're going to try and use the image of a bathtub. And so imagine that we have this bathtub and we have a faucet, and the faucet is turned on and water is flowing through it. That is our source of carbon. It's our source of greenhouse gas emissions coming in. And so these are things like burning of fossil fuels and cutting down of forests. So we have this constant flow of carbon, greenhouse gas emissions flowing into the bathtub. The more carbon we release in our day-to-day lives and in industry and lots of other different ways of releasing greenhouse gas emissions into the environment, we fill the bathtub, which means we're increasing the temperature of the bathtub and of the earth over time. just as would happen if we let the bathtub run longer and longer and get higher and higher. Now, the other end of the bathtub, we have the drain, and these are our sinks of carbon. So these are things like forests, oceans, soils, the grasslands of southern Alberta that are natural processes for removing carbon, removing greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. And so this is doing the job of the drain at the bottom of the bathtub to draw out the carbon coming in and take it away. And so the drain works well, and it keeps the water from rising too quickly if the rate of carbon coming in through the faucet, the rate of greenhouse gas emissions coming in, is roughly equal to the amount that the sinks can take out, and we don't have water or in this case greenhouse gas emissions accumulate in the bathtub. The problem is that the water in the bathtub doesn't just fill up, it also heats up. And so this is the reality of bringing more and more greenhouse gas emissions, more and more carbon into the atmosphere, is that it acts like a heat trap. Just like the water in a bathtub, it gets warmer and warmer the more you fill it. And this is what is leading to what we call global warming and the resultant climate change that we're experiencing around the Earth. And so if the faucet is bringing in too much and the sinks, the drain can't handle it, that's our analogy of the bathtub overflowing. And these are the negative impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather, rising sea levels, and disruptions to our ecosystems. So what is the world doing about this bathtub? What is the world doing about the discrepancy between carbon coming in, greenhouse gas emissions coming in, and our sinks taking them away? The world is dealing with it really in two broad categories. The first is mitigation, and so this is any action that will reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions. So any action that will reduce the flow coming from the faucet. And so examples for this include renewable energies such as wind and solar, although there are many, many more besides. Making buildings, vehicles, and other equipment more energy efficient, so we use less energy and produce less greenhouse gases. Switching to things like walking and cycling from time to time instead of using a car, or public transport would be included in there too. Waste management, like the reducing, reusing, and recycling mantras, and then also in planting more trees, which will themselves absorb and store carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. On the flip side, we have adaptation, and this is really what our work today and this presentation is about. We are focusing here on adaptation, and so these are deliberate actions by communities, by governments, in some instances by individuals, in response to either the current or the expected impacts of climate change. And they are broadly designed to reduce potential harm or take advantage of beneficial opportunities. And I think we need to be conscious that there are harms and that there are opportunities in some small part when we talk about climate change. And as Ali mentioned at the top of the presentation, part of our work here has been to look back at what we already know, to look at the past and present conditions. Jeff mentioned that there is data feeding into climate projection models, and this is data, this is information, these are stories and knowledge that come from both the past and the present of people living in Alberta, of nation citizens living in Alberta and being able to share that. And so that is our starting point before we look to the future. And so as we've been going through looking at work that has previously been undertaken by the nation and that has had citizens involved in it, we can see a whole body of historical scientific evidence for change across Alberta, and we've done that through our desktop review. and that we've got a multitude of key indicators, pieces of information that are telling us about changes in air quality, changes in the length or number of hot days, wildfire risk, drought, a whole number of other climate change risks and hazards, and that have all been associated with Métis observations and their noted impacts. And so we could have picked one of more of 100 or so, but just to sort of pick on two for the purposes of this presentation, the type of information that we're gathering and including in this work. Forest fires, weather impacts, breathing issues, animal habitats, force animals into cities. And this is a quote that came from the ski project ran through 2023. A second from the same body of work, Saskatoon berries are ripening late and drying out early. I believe that drought, heat waves, more extreme weather in general is contributing to this change. And so, we know already within this body of work that there's a huge wealth of knowledge and understanding that we can lean on as we look forward into what climate change is going to potentially impact us with in the future. And so what are those future changes? And thinking a little bit more about how could climate change impact you, impact us all in Alberta. And so to start to think about this a little bit, I'm going to draw on this chart, which has got quite a few different elements to it. So I'm going to take them all kind of one by one. What we're looking at here is a timeline that shows how the Earth's temperature has changed and could continue to change in the future. The timeline starts in around the 1900s and goes all the way out to 2100, so the end of this current century. And the image helps us understand, I hope, a little bit more about how much hotter the Earth will get, and depending on what we do about climate change today. And so what's the image showing? So on the left side, the blue and lighter colors in the 1900s up to sort of about the 1940s is showing us the Earth's temperature, which was a lot cooler than it is today. The colors, you'll note, warm up as we move towards the big black line at 2020, showing how the Earth has already heated up by about 1 degree Celsius compared to the start of the last century and through to the middle part of, around the 1980s, the middle part of the century. The color scale at the bottom shows how those temperatures have been increasing, and ultimately we get to the darker reds and purples, which is representing, really significant higher temperatures that we could potentially see in the future. But after 2020, we really have a variety of different possible futures, and this is depending on the choices that we make. So if we continue with what we call very high emissions scenarios, these are business as usual, us all carrying on in our day-to-day way, governments and industry carrying on in the day-to-day way, the Earth we know will get much hotter. And the color in the charts here shift towards, as I mentioned, those deep reds and purples, those hotter colors. However, if we reduce emissions, if we make choices to reduce emissions, for example, more renewable energy, planting more trees, using less fossil fuels, there's a whole variety of different things we can do. We know that the temperature increase will be lower. It's going to be an increase, but the increase will be lower, and that's represented by the yellow and lighter orange colors. Importantly, at the bottom of the chart, we can see 3 different generations and the differences of experiences of those generations. And so somebody born in the 1950s, and I'm going to kind of use my own family as an analogy here. My mother was born in the 1950s. I was born in the 1980s, and my little nephew was born in the 2020s. And so we can see the experiences that we have all had of different climates. So the climate that my mother experienced from the 1950s is demonstrably cooler than the climate that I've already experienced in my life. And then looking into the future scenarios, that will again be cooler than my nephew, and his experience of climate will be significantly warmer than his grandmother's. And so the big message here, and this is back to the weather versus climate conversation, is that the choices we make today will impact future temperature, the future temperature of the Earth, and the impact on different generations.
Thanks, Harry. On that note, I wanted to take a pause for you to reflect on if you've noticed warming in your lifetime, maybe in the last 30 years or so, or thinking maybe about the youngest person you know and the oldest person you know, and thinking about if they have experienced significant warming in their lifetime or if they will.
In that last chart, we had the distinction between historical and past climate data, and then some options for future climate scenarios, future warming of the Earth. And so that point between the past and the historic and the future is built on climate projections. And so to take a little bit of time here just to talk about what projections are. And so climate projections are predictions about how the climate could change in the future. Scientists from across Canada, from in Alberta, from all around the world, use computer programs that simulate the Earth's climate, and they do that to explore what might happen under different conditions. So, for example, if greenhouse gas emissions go up or down. And these projections can show possible changes in things like temperature, in rainfall, and in extreme weather events. And we're going to be sharing some climate projections later on in November. We'll be running a series of engagements that are specific to each of the nation's territories, and we're going to hopefully gain an understanding of how future climate change might impact citizens in those areas, but broadly across all of Alberta, because we know that people are impacted differently depending on where they live, what they're engaging in, and what they're up to in their own lives. But the climate projections are a simulation of all available data, and I think that's really an important point to make, is that we have satellite data, we have scientists in the field that are collecting weather observations using things like weather stations, but organizations, principally organizations like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they also bring in indigenous perspectives, local perspectives, knowledge from folks on the ground and in their homes and in their communities. And this is, this sort of top-down approach of data collection is all incorporated into what we call climate projections and climate models. And so just to take an example, one example of climate projections, and so here we have average daily temperature across Alberta for 3 different time zones, the 2030s, the 2050s, and the 2080s, compared back to the 1980s. And so the table here shows, and this is based on the climate projection data that we're using within this body of work, that by the end of the 2030s, so in the next 5 to 10 years, Alberta's average daily temperature will already have increased by about 2 degrees Celsius to be warmer than it was in the 1980s. When we look out to the 2050s, we're 2.5 degrees Celsius warmer, and by the 1980s, we could be as much as 3.5 degrees Celsius warmer, which means much, much hotter summers, far milder winters, and overall significant changes to the climate. But what does this sort of mean for some context? A 2 degree per day increase, a 2 degree warmer day across all of Alberta, puts Alberta a lot closer to the climate, to the environment that you would typically associate with southern British Columbia. And so what does this mean from an Alberta context? It means many fish species, such as trout and salmon, that prefer cooler waters, could find that the water becomes too warm and fish populations could decline. Water also holds a lot less oxygen, which makes it harder for all aquatic species and plants to be able to exist. That's just one possible impact. At 2.5 degrees warmer, by the time we get out to the 2050s, we're looking a little bit more like Southern California in terms of a comparison for day-to-day temperatures. As we all know, Alberta is home to the Rocky Mountains. And with this kind of increase in temperature, likely we'll see glaciers shrinking or even disappearing. And glaciers act as an incredibly important water source, water reservoir, providing fresh water for rivers during the warmer months, and if they melt too quickly, certainly that could lead to potential water shortages during drier periods. And by the time we get out to 3.5 degrees Celsius of warming by towards the end of this century, Alberta as a whole, and these are averages, but it's certainly looking more like Phoenix, Arizona, or maybe Las Vegas, Nevada, both in the US. And so this is substantially warmer, extreme heat in the summers, much milder winters. And so these heating events are going to last potentially longer. Water shortages, certainly increase in wildfires would be expected, and major shifts in things like agriculture, but growing in general. The reason why we start this conversation with increases in temperature is because, largely speaking, they're driving other climate change hazards that we can expect as we go through the next 10, 30, 50 years. And so across the body of work that we're talking about today and the impacts that a warming climate could produce, these are the key climate hazards that we will be looking at. And so the image is a word cloud, which visually represents the different climate hazards and extreme weather events that we are looking at, that we are evaluating within this body of work, and that are all being driven either directly or in part by rising temperatures. Events are either expected to increase in frequency or severity as a result of climate change, and these are things like wildfires, flooding, heat waves, droughts, and other extreme weather events. There are other potential impacts, such as glacial retreats, changes in water, or what we call ecoregion shift, and then additional impacts besides things like wildfire smoke increase, and specific hazards relating to these climate impacts. We are going to discuss a lot of these in more detail, using knowledge and perspectives from nation citizens across Alberta and other research in our engagements later on in the month of November.
Thanks, Harry. So I just wanted to take a moment for you to consider how prepared you feel for these climate change hazards we just shared. I know in Alberta, we're used to the cold, and there were snowstorms and blizzards on that list that, I think we're more ready for, right? But with the changes and more wildfires, smoke, heat waves, some of these things we're maybe not as prepared for. So I urge you to think, also what might help you feel more prepared for some of these things.
And so we know that Alberta is a diverse environment. It's got lots of different changes already happening across it, and those are predicted to continue. And so we know, as we say here, what happens on the prairies might not stay on the prairies. And this is really about understanding ecosystems and changes to them, which is an important part of the story because these represent the natural processes that protect health and wellness of all living things. An ecosystem provides clean air, water, and clean food. And we know one of the consequences of climate change and all the different impacts and things that we've already spoken about in this presentation we know one of the consequences is really changes to these ecoregions and what that could mean and what that could influence across Alberta. And so broadly speaking, Alberta is broken into 6 different ecosystem regions, as we call them. Boreal, which is the green color, Canadian Shield, which is the purple, Foothills is represented in the blue, Grasslands is orange, yellow is the Parkland ecosystem region, and then pink is the Rocky Mountains. And just to give a little bit of context maybe for where you're listening to this presentation from, we've added in the red line boundaries that mark the territories of the Métis Nation. An ecosystem region is a large area where plants, animals, the climate and geography all work together in a balanced way, and they form that unique environment. The Rocky Mountains is different to the grasslands or to the boreal forest. And so in examples of this, as I say, in Alberta, our grasslands that maybe open with a few trees, whereas the boreal forest is a colder area with more trees, lakes, and wetlands. So what's important about this is that climate change, we are going to be describing what we call ecosystem region shift. So that's a shift in these individual ecosystem regions. And that occurs when the climate or environment in those regions changes and causes one type of ecosystem region to gradually shift and transform into another. And so that's things like the grassland coming into the boreal forest and the boreal forest looking more like grasslands. And that's being driven by warming temperatures, things becoming drier and warmer over time. And the reason why this is important is because these shifts that we're already seeing and that we can see through the projection data are expected to continue, disrupt the balance of plant and animal life, the way that we go about our day-to-day lives and our livelihoods, and they change them for things including species that are suited to more cooler or wetter temperatures, and the climate disappears, and so then we have species that come in that really like those warmer temperatures that we're expecting to see in the climate data. And so a lot of these changes are going to be the basis upon which we go through our next round of engagements. As I've mentioned a few times, in November, we'll have 6 nights, and we're going to really take a much deeper dive into what is projected from a climate change perspective, and specifically how it's going to impact our ecoregions, and then hear from you all and from everyone that can join us, how these changes could impact you and what your perspectives on them are. And just to finish off our presentation today, I'm going to pass it back to Jeff.
Thank you very much, Harry. Thank you for all of those explanations. And I'm going to share a few comments here just on resilience before we turn it back to Ali to wrap up our presentation today. So we've spoken a lot about resilience. It's in the name of our organization, but what does resilience really mean? On the slide there, we also included a Northern Michif or Cree word, which is sipigissoin. Sipigissoin comes from the root word of sipio. Sipio means something that is stretchy or flexible. So sipigissoin refers to that ability to be flexible, to stretch, to adapt to what's happening around us. And in my discussions with different elders and knowledge keepers and just other Indigenous folks, I've heard a lot of people comment on how resilience is something that's almost built into Indigenous people, given all of the challenges that have been present for us to deal with over the years and decades. And so resilience is something, climate change, I should say, is something that's really just another challenge that people are going to have to respond to. So we want to acknowledge the strength and the resilience within Indigenous nations, including the Métis Nation of Alberta, and just honor that as well. I've also heard discussion of people just hoping someday we don't have to be resilient anymore, but we're going to have to wait a little bit before we get there. So just on resilience, again, a little bit more, I'll give just a quick kind of a dictionary definition of resilience. It's really the ability of a a person to adapt to recover from, or bounce back from challenges, stress, or adversity. And in this case, it's the challenges, stresses, and adversities that climate change is bringing to us, and all of the hazards that Harry was just mentioning. I think it's important to note as well that resilience can also be understood from a community perspective. And that's something that I think as community-based people, Indigenous people, have learned to rely on each other for a long time to get through a lot of the past trials and tribulations. So community resilience can be understood as the ability of a community or a group to anticipate, prepare for, and recover from adverse events. And again, in this case, that refers first to climate change. And that is something that I think as we begin to encounter these issues, these challenges, these hazards and risks, that we're going to have to, learn to rely on each other once again, and rely on those community networks to keep us all safe. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ali, who's going to just wrap up for us.
Thanks, Jeff.
Oh.
Yes, so this is an image from some previous work we did talking about health and climate change within the Métis Nation. And we talked a lot about risks today and hazards. And thanks, Jeff, for talking about resilience. Moving forward with this whole project, we want to do our best to uplift resilience within the nation, protecting traditional ecological knowledge, strong community and familial relationships, spiritual and cultural practices, and the ability to adapt to changes. So I know we threw a lot at you today, but I'm hoping you took something from this in your understanding of climate change within Alberta, and what that means for the Métis Nation. And so just hopefully you'll have a little bit of solace too, knowing that we are working on this. For those who were able to attend the live engagements, we then had a question period and some breakout sessions where we asked that question we shared at the beginning about, what would help you feel more prepared for some of these changes. And we welcomed a discussion to talk about some of the things we just heard. We, of course, would love to hear anything from you watching this. Thank you so much for sticking around to listen. If there's any questions you have about the presentation, about any of the content, please feel free to reach out. As I said, if you are catching this before the end of December, we should have a survey out as well talking about emergency preparedness and climate change in Alberta. We would love to hear your input. And if you fill that out, and if you're a citizen of the Métis Nation, you'll have a chance to win one of 10 $100 cash gifts. So I urge you to fill that out. And with that, I think we'll wrap up our presentation. I just want to say, Marcy, thank you. We really appreciate you listening through this and taking the time to, learn a little bit more about this topic. And, we have tried to engage as many citizens as we can, that everyone's contributions will help the nation locate and enable Métis-driven solutions to the changing climate, and will secure the future of our communities and the nation for generations to come. So thank you so much. And if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to reach out. The email is on the screen there, climate@métis.org. And we'll be happy to help you. So thank you.